You should be. Still says practice.
It's okay.
Good morning, everyone. I'm David Goldman, Deputy Editor of Asia Times, and I'm co-hosting this webinar with Julius Krein, the Editor of American Affairs. Thank you very much for participating. I'd like to turn the discussion over to Julius, who will introduce a distinguished panel, which we are honored to host for this discussion.
Thank you, David. I'm Julius Krein, editor of American Affairs. Very pleased to co-host this event with David and Asia Times. In putting together this event, I think David and I both wanted to hopefully illuminate a crucial economic issue, as well as perhaps shed some light on larger policy questions in a world which is increasingly defined by international competition, but also one that is defined by interconnection and interdependence, and where competition need not necessarily preclude every possibility for cooperation and the like. So we're very pleased to have with us to guide us through this issue the following panelists, whom I'll introduce briefly in alphabetical order. Nigel Corey covers trade policy at the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. He focuses on cross-border data flows, data governance, intellectual property, and how they each relate to digital trade and the broader digital economy. He previously worked at the Center for Strategic and International Studies and Australia's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Jintai Ding is a professor at the Yale Mathematical Sciences Center at Tsinghua University and the director of the Ding Lab in Privacy Protection and Blockchain Security at Beijing Institute of Mathematical Sciences and Applications. His current interest is in post-quantum cryptography. He was also a co-chair of the 2nd, 10th, and 11th International Conferences on Post-Quantum Cryptography. He and his colleagues developed the Rainbow Signature and the LWE-based key exchange schemes. Next, we have Lawrence Gassman, who's the president of IQT Research, specializing in quantum computing and other quantum technologies. He has written widely on both policy and technology issues related to telecommunications, nanotechnology, and quantum technology, including 4 books on these topics. Andy Purdy is the Chief Security Officer for Huawei Technologies USA. Previously, he served on the White House staff where he drafted the 2003 National Security Strategy to secure cyberspace. He also served in senior cybersecurity positions at the Department of Homeland Security. He is vice chair of the Open Group Trusted Technology Forum. And finally, Tom Stefanik is a visiting fellow in the Center for Security, Strategy, and Technology at the Brookings Institution. As a scientific consultant, he supported R&D and operations analysis for the U.S. Navy and the intelligence community and advised the House Armed Services Committee on anti-submarine warfare. Before I turn it over to David, I suppose I should just note quickly that as custom dictates, we will open it up to Q&A toward the end of the event, and you can submit questions via the chat function, presumably at any time, and we'll field them from there. And also just note that this event is recorded and the video will likely be made available to the public. And so with that, I'll turn it back over to David to begin the discussion.
Oh, thank you, Julius. To coin a phrase it's the best of times and the worst of times for data. On the one side, we read that China has just established a national data exchange at Shanghai for trading of data, and the Chinese government has declared that data is a new factor of production on par with land, labor, and capital. Certainly a revolution in economic thinking, which has been long in the making, and the prospects for a global, efficient market and data exchange, which will raise productivity and drive the fourth industrial revolution, seem very bright. On the other hand, as I look at the news, government may, and I emphasize the subjunctive, steal large amounts of data which it can't yet decipher in order to store it up so that quantum computers, sometime around 2030, are going to crack it all. What we really want to know, of course, is whether hackers are going to use quantum computers to steal our Bitcoin accounts. So the degree of concern about data security,
more than just sort of saying data is useful. Data is useful within governance spheres, and that's going to be nationally. That's going to be separated by nations pretty naturally. And the area that I'm most worried about, actually, I'm opening up. I realize that I'm opening up a somewhat different dimension here. The area I'm most concerned about is data controlling physical devices of infrastructure. Now, I know this is a little bit off the main economic sphere. However, in terms of its risk potential for nations and risk potential for creating instabilities between US and China, US and Russia, and other countries, I think the use of data or the attack of data that's controlling, say, the electricity grid or water, gas lines, that sort of thing, is what worries me most.
Thank you. Andy, would you like to continue, please?
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you all today. In terms of most hopeful, I guess I'm seeing a growing recognition of the importance of data, both in terms of that which our systems rely on and personal data. And I think there's a widespread view that the European Privacy Directive, GDPR, has stimulated an awful lot of activity by companies that are primarily working within the EU and others, including my own company, to really raise the bar in terms of the internal processes and oversight, internal compliance, to try to make sure that folks know where the data is, what's happening to it, is it protected, and so forth. I don't think the GDPR goes far enough. I think the interest in collaboration among countries, most recently the US with the G7 and G20, hopefully with the European Union generally and others, to try to identify and set standards related to cybersecurity, but hopefully also related to privacy, to data protection, and to try to avoid what one can be concerned about. And one concern is the potential for overly restrictive data localization requirements by individual countries that on the one hand gives a feeling of protecting data, but on the other, it disadvantages the companies within a particular country and encourages other countries to have a retaliatory approach. And instead, hopefully, a more nuanced, more intelligent look at how to identify what is absolutely critical, how to protect that, but allow data to flow otherwise. Because as you know, data flows are critically important to the use of AI technologies. And so making sure that we have rules of the road for what data will flow, how freely, and how it will be protected, and hopefully in ways that there can be some accountability for that data. This would be a major change in terms of the United States. The United States, it seems to me, has a a particular approach to privacy that seems a little bit similar to the approach in the early days, and Tom's an expert in this, to CFIUS, where there's a focus and concern about undue foreign influence and control over anything in the United States. It certainly predates the recent unpleasantries between the US and China, and rather try to look at where's the data, who has the data, how is it protected, how can we track it, and to what extent can there be audits, hopefully independent audits, that companies and other organizations can undergo regarding both privacy and cybersecurity. So we have a handle on where things are before really bad things happen. And I think that would be a step forward.
Thank you. Lawrence, would you like to continue, please? Lawrence Gassman? We may be having a Lawrence. Would you like to continue? I think Lawrence's sound is off. I'll text him. Jintai, would you like to continue?
Sure. Yes, somewhat different things. Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Fine.
Yes.
Yes, Lawrence. I'm sorry, Lawrence. Or we all right. Can you hear me? Lawrence, I think your sound is off. While Lawrence gets his sound together, Jintai, would you like to continue? I'm sorry for the glitch.
Oh, that's okay. Yes. First, of course, thank David, thank Julius for the opportunity to speak here. And yes, good morning and good afternoon, good evening, everybody.
Oh, okay. I'm a bit confused. Yes.
So should I continue or should I?
Lawrence, do you want to continue? Do you have your? Do we have your sound now?
Not from this end.
Can you hear me, Lawrence? Jintai, please continue.
Okay. Okay, thanks. So for me, I think my concern is, is related to privacy. I think we need to have a balance between privacy and, data flow, So I'm afraid things are going extremes in some way to end either way. So
you can hear me?
We can hear you now.
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes. Lawrence will come back to you in a moment. Jintai, please continue.
Should I continue? Okay.
Yes, please.
Yes.
Sorry about this.
So yeah. So my concern would be how to strike a balance, how to make free use of data on the hand can protect the privacy. I think people tend to, I feel that people tend to stand on the two extremes. I think how to strike a balance, this is my concern. I think that's what we. In terms of hopefully, I think I'm really looking forward to. I think we must work together. For example, David mentioned about the content threat.
Okay.
Is that okay? Should I continue? This is
yes. Please continue, Jintai.
Okay. So I have been working in post-quantum for 20 years. I think our modern information system rely completely on public key cryptography, including Bitcoin, which David mentioned earlier. If we have a quantum computer, our Zoom will be finished. Everything actually, the whole information system will be done, because our fundamental security solution relies on public key cryptography, and what we're using now is ISA or elliptic curve cryptography can be completely broken by quantum computers. And the NIST are now making the standards, and I think the Chinese government probably will make one. I mean, European probably make one. I think in this is area we must work together to ensure we have a smooth transition from the current public cryptography to the future post-quantum topic. I think we must. I'm very much looking forward to, people should work together, find the best solution, because there are a lot of issues we have to deal with. And so the transition process will be also very difficult. Everything we use now, as long as the public cryptography, we must replace it with appropriate solutions coming from post-quantum cryptography. I think I'm really think we must work together to do this smooth transition. Otherwise, the whole IT system, the whole financial system will not run well, I think. So this is what I'm hoping for. Okay, thanks.
You just absolutely stunned me, Jintai. I've heard dark rumors that even 250K public key cryptography isn't safe anymore. But no one really knows how far we are along. And I think you just dropped a bomb here, which we'll be talking about a great deal. But while we collect ourselves and recover from the shock, I'd like to hear from Lawrence Gassman and Nigel Corey. So Lawrence, why don't you go ahead? Lawrence, can you hear me? Hello? Lawrence? Can you hear me now? Lawrence, well, Nigel, I'm sorry, why don't you go ahead? I'll set a note to Lawrence.
No worries. Thanks, David. Thanks, Julius. It's great to be here.
Okay. So on the, well, yes, I can hear you. Hello.
Oh, okay. Well, then, why don't you go?
I'm going to talk. Yes.
Please go ahead, Lawrence. I'm sorry, Nigel. I apologize for the glitch. Lawrence,
yes.
Can you go ahead? Yes, please.
Should I go ahead?
Yes, please go ahead. But you can't hear me now.
Okay. Well, hopefully I'm going ahead. Let me start with the pessimistic side, and I'm going to focus on. Let me start with the. I can hear you.
Yes, go ahead.
So let me start with the pessimistic. I can hear you.
Yes, well, please speak. Oh.
I think there's probably just a very long delay. It may help, Lawrence, if you turn your video
No,
off, and we could just use audio.
In the meantime, Nigel, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, sure. No worries. David, Julius, appreciate the opportunity to speak here. I'll draw on some of the strands that my fellow panelists have already mentioned. I'll start with the positive case.
Turning off video.
Can
you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
I am speaking.
Yes, can you hear us? Well, I apologize to everyone for the glitch.
I've just turned it off.
Yes, well, Lawrence, can you hear me now? I'll ask Lawrence to wait. Nigel, please go ahead.
Okay. Just to try and wrap things up, I'll start on the positive side and draw on some of the remarks that some of the other panelists have mentioned in that the increasing focus on data, how it's managed, and
yes.
Oh God.
Nigel, please go ahead.
Yeah. Is obviously generating concerns and conflict between different regulatory regimes, obviously, especially between China and the US, but also the US and the EU. The question is like, what policy response does that provoke? Whether it's one towards cooperation in enacting new mechanisms to account for those concerns, such as around surveillance, government access to data, as it relates to digital trade and data innovation, or does it simply revert to increasing concerns and controls and restrictions around the use of data, which is essentially what we're seeing from China, in that And what this exposes in this sort of like positive and negative sort of analysis of what's going on with global data governance is how do states conceptualize and apply sovereignty in the digital era? Do they associate sort of data sort of management and data data privacy and data protection through basically the accountability principle, and that firms are accountable for how they manage data regardless of where it goes? Or do they use the Chinese approach and associate sort of data responsibilities through the location of data, a focus on where it's stored and who's it's controlled by? And they're very contrasting approaches. And so thankfully, we've seen greater action by the G7, the United States, also other countries like Singapore, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Singapore, who have come together and recognized they need to create new rules around data to provide regulatory certainty, but also certainty for digital trade. And thus far, what we've seen is the emergence of very different and at times conflicting sort of data governance models.
Well, let me follow up and start with Jintai's observation that public key encryption can't be relied on, whether it can be relied on now or will not be reliable in a small number of years. Obviously, I've got no idea, but clearly there is deep concern about the viability of current encryption standards. Jintai's argument is that governments have to come up with an agreement on alternative encryption standards. Tom, let me go back to you and ask if there's been any discussion about this that you're aware of at the US government level, or any progress on this. Do you have a thought about this issue?
I actually don't know about that specific question. I mean, I would just, so about the standards for quantum secure encryption or post-quantum encryption standards. Of course, Jintai mentioned the NIST, the series of competitions that are going on in NIST to develop that. But in terms of international cooperation, I simply don't know. I can say that there are multiple parallel discussions going on about data security. One, and this is true in China, every nation has this. There are data security for national security information. All militaries, the Chinese military, the US military, they're all sort of they use the internet for national security information with a different level of with the specialized levels of encryption. And that's directly connected with satellites and information flows for military operations. So that's one completely separate level. And then within the government, there are other standards that are not necessarily military. And there's deep concern about that, but that will happen. I guess, as I said before, that will happen on a nation by nation kind of basis. The developments of standards for those kind of those national level security concerns.
Lawrence Gaspin, can you hear me now? Can you? We're getting your answers with a long delay. Lawrence texts me that he can hear us, but his answers have a long delay. And I'm really not sure what to do. So Lawrence, hang tight for a second. Let me ask a question of Andy Purdy. The United States has expressed great concern about your company's role in large-scale data transmission, the view that having a Chinese company build large-scale 5G networks is a security issue. I mean, that's quite public. if the whole landscape changes and encryption standards change.
Okay, yes,
Can you say something, Lawrence? Can you?
so hope.
Well, Lawrence, I'm afraid I'm going to have to move on because we're simply not able to communicate. Perhaps try logging off and logging back in again. Andy, as I was saying, if encryption standards change drastically, if we're moving to an era of quantum decryption and quantum encryption, doesn't that change the entire discussion between the United States and China and the issue of data security and networks and so forth? Doesn't that just turn the table over?
Well, I think just short of that point, I think
Yes,
the world
testing 1, 2, 3, 4.
Yes, go ahead, Andy. Sorry.
I think the world is changing anyway. When you look at particularly the recent cyber attacks to SolarWinds and Microsoft Exchange Server, a recognition that so-called trusted suppliers cannot be trusted. And that's no offense to SolarWinds or Microsoft Exchange Server. The sophistication of the malicious actors is such that everyone needs to improve their defenses. I mean, I was reading Inside Cybersecurity this morning, and the number of activities that trade associations, comments by ITIF and many, many others, work at the Commerce Department, everybody recognizes that there needs to be an increase in the standards, supply chain risks, software assurance, moving towards zero trust principles. All these things are fundamentally important. And the notion that because we trusted somebody in the past, we can trust them now is OBE. And that so everything needs to be done differently now. And that's one of the reasons why the collaboration that's occurring within the United States hopefully is also going to collaborate with countries outside the United States. And hopefully the US is actually going to participate actively in the 5G standards, other targeted standards such as telecom equipment, and support American associations and American companies to help them financially so they can participate in the standards effort. So all that work is absolutely critical. Plus the whole area of privacy protection. Hopefully the US is going to be part of the action to try to help actually create very firm requirements, hopefully audit requirements for privacy, and not simply look at things in the old way, which is who owns and controls the company. That is not good enough. But to your question, yes, as the encryption standards change, there will be a whole new world for everybody. And how everyone deals with this is going to be up in the air. So hopefully the kinds of discussions that are taking place between the US and China behind the scenes, the Track 2 economic dialogue, hopefully other discussions such as NIS2 in Europe, hopefully all these discussions are going to include the question of how do we come up with agreement on what kinds of new standards, what kinds of new techniques can enable an objective and transparent basis for trust after we are into quantum computing.
On the strength of Jintime, the strength of Andy's comment, when you talk about need for cooperation on security standards in the era of quantum computing, could you give us a little bit of background about this? Because I think you have everyone's undivided attention on this issue.
Yeah, so in 2016, NSA first announced, that's August, I believe it's August 19th, 2016, NSA announced the US will make next generation standards. Then start from 2017, NIST started the process. We have gone through several years of selecting standards. And if you pay attention to it, there are pretty big disagreement on how to select those standards. So traditionally, for example, if you look at ISA or ECC, we are pretty agree on the parameters and everything. But now we are actually, for example, just look at, not only encryption is important, there's another thing very important is digital signature, because that's where the trust coming from. For example, when you receive a software update from Microsoft, your computer will automatically check, use Microsoft the public key to verify it is indeed coming from Microsoft, not from somebody else. to ensure it's a secure software update. So digital signature is also extremely important. This is what's used in Bitcoin. And right now we have, in the NIST process, we have 3 finalists. One of them is called Rainbow, which is designed by me, and the other 2 are lattice-based standards. And my design is called multivariate-based standards. They all have its own advantage, disadvantage. And which one to use in what circumstances is very important. It affects the performance and so on. So unlike before, I think we will not have only one algorithm. We have several algorithms, and where to use which one and so on. It will cause a lot of confusion. And so therefore, across the border, in order to make a system run smoothly, we must collaborate and we must decide, which one to use in which circumstance. So I don't think in the crypto community, we agree that this is the best. We should all use this. No, we don't have such agreement. There's big fights now in the NIST standardization process, if you pay attention. So there's a called NIST Post-Quantum Forum in the Google groups. You can look at them. Big fights about security. We don't even agree on which one is the most secure. And so this, I really like the NIST process because it's transparent and people can decide from their own, understanding, so which one to use. So I think China probably do the same, European probably do the same. And if we cannot agree on which standard to use, that would be terrible. And to do that, the whole process has to be transparent. I think we'll have to agree on something. I think this is really important. I think we have to have a transparent process to ensure we select the best standard we can agree on. If we cannot do that, I doubt the next generation of communications will be the same as now, because we cannot use completely different security or digital signature standards to run the system. We just cannot. I cannot see that could work. So therefore, I believe there's a strong demand that we must work together to select the best standards to ensure we can smoothly transition to the next period. And David mentioned a very good question earlier. People always ask me exactly when the quantum computer will come. I actually don't know. I mean, in the US, as far as I understand, by 2030, everything should be changed to post-quantum state. Does that mean there will be a quantum computer time? I don't know. But for me, it's always very interesting to look at history, right? We know in the Second World War, Turing and so on, they broke the German Enigma machine in 1940s, but we didn't know it until 1980s, 90s. So this is a very interesting game in terms of understanding the situation, I think. You know what I mean, right? So
yes,
let's
exactly.
just play a joke, right? Suppose I have a quantum computer. What should I do? Should I tell anybody? No, absolutely not. Because a quantum computer allow me to read everybody's account, email, allow me to get into everybody's bank account. Why should I tell anybody?
Yes, I actually wrote a spy novel about this last year called The Quantum Supremacy.
Yes. So it will be a very historical event, I think, somebody who first had a quantum computer, and they have to decide what to do with it. Should they tell everybody? I doubt it. I think I would keep it, maintain my advantage. You know what I mean?
I know exactly what you mean. Nigel, let me ask a related question. In certain areas of big data, China clearly has an enormous advantage. Health, for example, medical use of big data is an important application. China, for various reasons, including regulatory and privacy laws, has a vast database of digitized medical records, sequenced DNA, and so forth. They use that quite effectively to crack down on the COVID epidemic. Given the fact that China has a natural advantage in this new resource, it's the Saudi Arabia of data, so to speak, and there's so much tension between China and Western nations over so many other issues. How do you see this netting out when we sit down to discuss data standards and data exchange with China?
It's an interesting question. Obviously, China has a natural advantage in the size of its country. It's very digitally connected, digitized. It's obviously the home of a number of very innovative companies that have proven themselves adept at using data in new and interesting ways. But when you zoom out and you put what China has done in the bigger picture, it raises a number of concerns in terms of how they've done it. and thinking about China's approach more broadly, in that obviously they have a natural advantage with the data they generate and use at home, but its ever evolving sort of more restrictive data governance model through its data security law, the cybersecurity law, its new personal information protection law, provides a sort of growing sort of set of restrictions and potential for arbitrary state action as it relates to data that makes it difficult for Chinese firms and Chinese citizens to connect with the rest of the global internet. And it also highlights a growing sort of lack of reciprocity in that Chinese firms can now enter into the United States, into Europe and many other countries using their Chinese-based IT infrastructure and engage in these economies on a level basis, whereas foreign firms can't do the same in China. And so as more and more policymakers recognize that how organizations use data is at the heart of modern competitiveness and innovation, they recognize that these types of data-related barriers to digital trade and innovation are increasingly sort of like unfair, essentially. And so that creates tension, obviously, within a trade context. It was a tension within the Regional Cooperation for Economic Partnership, the RCEP agreement. It's a serious point of contention at World Trade Organization e-commerce negotiations, because China's model is just fundamentally different to most other countries around the world, because it associates the location of data with control and sovereignty, whereas the vast majority of countries focus on holding firms accountable for how they manage data, regardless of where they store it. And that focus on geography is a central sort of differential sort of characteristic that is fundamental to whether we and policymakers, countries around the world, are able to come together and create new rules, new norms, new standards around data so that it continue to flow freely as it generally tends to do on the internet, so that firms, individuals, consumers can all benefit from data flows in the digital economy like we have, or whether we end up with a world where countries enact an increasing array of barriers to the movement of data, which inevitably harm or inhibit or prohibit how firms can use data and come up with new goods and services.
Let me remind our listeners that there is a Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you want to ask a question, please write it down. We'll try to get to all of them sometime later. Tom Stefanik, we're living in an era of, let's say, concerning strategic tensions between the United States and China. The Chinese certainly have taken certain steps to which you might call protectionist. For example, they've forced Chinese companies to pull initial public offerings out of the US market out of fear that their data, private data of Chinese citizens, might be compromised by operations in the United States, or at least that's what they've said. Chinese have very strict standards in their new data law on export of data. And the United States, of course, has taken all kinds of measures, including excluding Chinese companies from its network and putting Chinese companies in the entity list for using US technology. Given all of these changes, what would you, as a longstanding consultant to the US military, US Congress, what would you recommend the United States do? What kind of approach would you suggest?
Well, that's a great question. And I think there's, again, going back to trying to parse out, the different kinds of data. There's a data that's, on the economic sphere, that's data that's important for logistics, for example. That's undoubtedly something that there has to be common standards for and cooperation for. We're so the entire globe is so connected through logistics change and ordering chains and that sort of thing, that these kind of direct kind of business to business or economic, the use of data to predict demands, seasonal demands, that sort of thing. These kinds of things are going to be important for efficient global networks to function. So that's, that's not separate, but it's very different than someone's Facebook data or someone's personal data, someone's personal identifiable purchasing data, which is, of course, very different than data on personal data that it's security oriented. So we know that there's a lot of espionage that goes on over the internet, and that goes on both ways. We have very public knowledge of a large amount of very personal data coming from the Office of Personnel Management, probably to China. It's these multiple levels that what I foresee in the future is a sort of greater sort of partitioning of data and perhaps data standards or encryption standards that go more from, right now, there's of course national security data, which has its own encryption standards. But I could foresee a natural sort of progression that covers different kinds of data. I'm not sure how that would work, but that would probably be the way I would deal with it. And then going back to the point I made at the beginning, I think it's it's an absolute priority in China and in the United States and every other country to secure their own infrastructure of data control networks. The internet controls over gas production, gas lines, electricity lines, that sort of thing.
Yes.
Over.
Andy, coming back to your point before about the international standard setting bodies, you're deeply involved with those organizations in terms of 5G. China has, I think, 70% of the world's installed 5G capacity last time I checked, so it will certainly be a major factor in that. Is that an appropriate forum for addressing the kind of issues that Jintai mentioned in terms of data security and encryption standards? In other words, if we were to say, yes, we absolutely have to come up with some kind of agreement on what secure data encryption is, what data safety is, would that go through the kind of bodies you're involved with? How would that work out? I mean, we're talking about a kind of, we can barely agree on tariffs and trade and, very minor issues of the kind that economists have dealt with for centuries. And now we're dealing with stuff that people like me are baffled by technically. How would such an agreement on encryption standards work itself out? What kind of bodies, what kind of negotiating process might be appropriate?
Let me make two somewhat different points. The first one is, I don't have an answer as to how that actually would work. I think the relative success recognized by most at an organization like 3GPP and their coalition often with GSMA to bring together governments and private organizations to develop the 5G standards, the telecom equipment standards such as NESIS, Network Equipment Security Assurance Scheme. The idea of that kind of collaboration is critically important, but it's going to be open season on how such agreements are going to be discussed. I think there may be some bilateral aspects of it as well. But the point is that major folks need to recognize it has to happen, and major groups need to come together to have those discussions. And I would suggest ANISA would be part of it, ASEAN perhaps. But the second point, I wanted to respond to something Nigel said, and I think I agree with everything Nigel said a moment ago, that questions about what kinds of agreements there can and should be and might be between the US and China, that slate remains to be written. You've seen our new US Trade Representative, Ambassador Catherine Tai, going on at some length about the importance of trying to identify issues that the US and China can agree on that may have sufficient mutual advantage. Issues, for example, about making sure there's fairness between the US and China in terms of access of companies to other companies' markets, trying to avoid forced technology transfer, trying to do some of the things that the economic dialogue, the track two, have talked about in trying to identify what are the national security requirements that different countries have so that folks can try to align what they're doing. All these important discussions have to go on so that we can try to find areas where there can be agreement, but there needs to be some consequences if a government fails to meet the requirements of those agreements. And that's been one of the things that has troubled us for some time, including some of the concerns about activities within the WTO.
Could you elaborate a bit on when you talk about consequences? No one's faced consequences for violating WTO rules for a long time.
Well, I think the WTO structure has what they consider consequences. So I don't want to completely eliminate the difficult, painful, laborious, time-consuming process of trying to determine whether there's been a violation and what the consequences will be for doing that. I think we need to continue down that path, but I think we need to build on some of the work the UN has done with the UN group of governmental experts with the norms of conduct. And the idea of saying the norms of conduct need to be focused on not just in terms of what governments do, but also about private companies. And I think we need to really push the envelope on the global community. We need to look at, for example, what the China government announced in 2020, the Global Initiative on Data Security, where some of the things they said they believe in. I know a lot of people responded and say, well, there's not any point in talking to them. But for example, that document says that China says that any country that hosts a company should not use that company to install backdoors or do other bad things. So my suggestion is that we try to build on the UN norms of conduct, build on some of those really excellent provisions in a global initiative on data security, and let's create a mechanism where countries will sign mutual trust agreements with other countries, promising to meet whatever the requirements are of the norms and signing on to some kinds of financial consequences. Similarly, and it's easier here, have private companies sign agreements, not just with their customers, but sign agreements with governments. And I would like to see the governments, when they sign agreements with governments, subjecting themselves to the local laws of that country so that the consequences can be imposed by whatever that process is. But trying to get governments and private companies to step up and say, we will agree, this is what we promise to do. And in the case of private companies, we could say something like, we agree that the consequences for a violation would be penalty levels at a magnitude equivalent to the European Privacy Directive, which is 4% of global gross revenues. That has had an impact on a lot of companies around the world, and I think it would have an impact on companies in trying to come up with greater accountability for global norms.
Nigel, I read with great interest your article on data trade in the volume published by the China Center for Globalization recently. We mentioned in Asia Times. Kudos on that. But apart from your view as a diplomat, as an observer, do you see any flickering of light anywhere in governments of the world? Are people taking this seriously? Is it on the agenda? Are people alarmed about it, or are they just letting it drift?
I try and keep a focus on that to give me something optimistic to work towards, because to be honest, in working on data governance, digital trade, it's very easy to be pessimistic about where the trend line is going, which is largely in the wrong direction around restrictions and controls. But there are some countries that recognize the value of an open, rules-based global digital economy that are stepping up to try and create new rules, new norms, new forums, because they recognize what's at stake here in terms of of a key characteristic, key foundation of a sort of vibrant digital economy, such that, like, obviously, for example, like the United Kingdom, as chair of the G7, is hosting a number of really important digital discussions, including on coming up with a framework around government access to data, which is obviously an issue at the foundation of many sort of countries' concerns. And that if the idea being is that you can set a common framework for how governments manage this sensitive issue, then that allows you to remove that as a concern that countries can misuse for digital protectionism. And it starts to establish standards. Singapore, New Zealand, and Chile have created a digital economy partnership agreement, which is their effort to go above the CPTPP, the sort of regional trade agreement, in setting new rules around data, but also importantly, new mechanisms for cooperation around digital governance to basically push the ball forward, to raise the bar about the type of regional arrangements they want to see in place. And so I take heart from that, in that these countries are trying to build these new measures, because it recognizes the fact that there's a vacuum. There is no single forum that deals with data governance or the digital economy. And so it's incumbent upon those countries that recognize the value to step up and show leadership and put things on the agenda to try and create these rules. And to be honest, the United States has largely been absent from that in the last 5 or 10 years, despite it obviously being home to a world-leading tech sector, in that we just haven't seen the creativity, the ambition from the United States to play its role with its partners like Japan and Singapore and Australia to really try and sort of come up with new rules and norms on this. So it's an ongoing struggle, and it's an ongoing battle. And in the meantime, we have China and India and others and Russia pursuing sort of very different approaches that undermine the potential for sort of an open global digital economy.
Andy, let me ask you, in your capacity as a longtime Washington observer, you've served at very high levels in data security in the US government. Can you respond to Nigel's view? Do you see any flickering of interest in the US government in addressing these critical issues? Do you see any initiative coming through? Anything for us to watch in the future?
I think there's an extraordinary amount of stuff that's happening. A large amount of it is quite encouraging. I think the criticality of the private sector trying to provide nuance and basically inform guidance is going to be absolutely critical. I think there can be a tendency to have least common denominator, a tendency to just have some kind of a blanket action that may not be that beneficial. So I think the collaboration we're seeing coming out of the Biden executive order on cybersecurity from a couple months ago, I think is very encouraging. Some of the work that's pending in Congress to try to understand better the threats to wireless, the risks involved in 5G, trying to put together a panel that would work on studying 6G. But I think, and I'll reference an article by Rob Atkinson with ITIF. He wrote an article recently that is really looking at, we can't just look at things that we do or money that we spend and think that it's going to help America build its general competitive technology advantage over China. So Rob's article was, don't claim the infrastructure and Build Back Better bills will help us outcompete China. And he does a laborious effort to dissect that legislation to look at what's actually going to help American competitiveness. And so I think there are a number of activities. There's a much greater concern to recognize that there are things that we need to do. And I think under this administration, there's a greater recognition that we have to do things that can help America succeed in competing. And I think if we could stop and say, let's get a private sector-led effort to focus on what are really most important for America to grow its competitive advantage, including some of the principles that Rob lays out in his article, I think that would all be for the good. I'm reminded of a comment that Senator King of Maine made a couple months ago on one of the Sunday shows, where he said the recent cyber attacks have really energized folks. He said, as a wake-up call for cybersecurity, and he said, but the problem is we keep falling back asleep. And I think there's no question that that's the case, that we have to come up with goals, objectives, and milestones. We have to encourage Congress to provide congressional oversight because I think in the last 18 years, congressional oversight in cybersecurity has generally been an oxymoron. But there seems to be more attention being paid, and the role of the private sector to lead this, I think, is absolutely critical. So there's reason for encouragement.
Thanks. Tom Stefanik, any thoughts you'd like to add to this?
Well, I have something that's more or less a question for Nigel about the U.S. not being, and I'm just curious about this because it's not my area, the U.S. not sort of stepping up to these processes that you mentioned before and these standards. Now, so there's an internal political dynamic in the United States between sort of the large tech companies, the social media and online retail companies, and on the Hill. And so there's that dynamic, but there's also a kind of a broader dynamic that these companies are very profitable. The largest of them are just historically profitable. And so what is the incentive? Where's the drive for the United States to change anything? Over to you. If I can, David.
No. I'm happy you asked. I mean, because, and I highlight the fact that the US thus far at the grand strategic level has largely seen sort of the global digital economy through the lens of the human rights lens, like a free and open internet, which is fine and good, but the increasing focus of countries around the world is the digital economy. So what's the trade and economic aspect? And we just haven't seen the leadership from the US on this, where you think that this is obviously something that would support the US economy and its many tech leading firms, that it would want to be a key driver in the rules and of the road for these firms in the global digital economy, recognizing that there is this growing counter trend that would in the future prohibit these firms and other firms and SMEs and startups and whatever else from taking advantage of an open global digital economy like firms have been able to do thus far. And so, for example, like Japan led with the initiative on data free flow of trust when it was chair of the G20. And the US was rather lukewarm on it and just didn't see the value in it. And at the WTO with the e-commerce negotiations, the US just has not been as gauged in the agenda and putting proposals forward on the rules there, again, in a forum on an issue that lends itself to how its economy is shaped. And so it's this funny gulf, right? Like it stands to gain a lot by shaping the rules, yet it hasn't sort of seized that role. And then in the current context, we have in the Biden administration with USTR TIE, a real reluctance to prosecute or prioritize digital trade issues and engagement. And so we're really, and I know this from Congress as well, just really unsure what, besides negotiating a new privacy shield with Europe and the EU-US Trade and Technology Council, really just unsure of what the Biden administration wants to do on global digital economic and technology issues. And that stands in constant contrast with the fact that it's at home to all these firms. And building on a point Andy made, I think, and I take some encouragement from it, is the fact that we have so many private firms stepping up and putting forward policy ideas and initiatives is really good, but it's also reflective, I think, of a fact that they just don't see enough action from the US government. And so they feel a need to sort of help fill the vacuum a bit by putting forward their own ideas and initiatives, which I think is really positive, but like it needs the government partnership there to sort of truly bring these initiatives and ideas to life to make progress on many of these issues which are shared across the world, not just here in the United States.
Jintai, let me come back to you. We've kind of reached a point in the discussion where the consensus is that we've got a big problem and governments are not addressing it. So what happens if governments fail to address these issues? I have an image in my mind of the 16th century where the Spanish mined gold from the New World and they put it on ships, and British privateers led by Francis Drake go and steal the gold from the ships. Are we going to have the same kind of piratical chaos in data trade that we had in trade in gold bullion in the past before you had international agreement about laws of the seas? What are the consequences of not addressing these issues? What's our worst case scenario?
This is a very interesting, very good question. So maybe I say first, I would like to say a few words. So I moved to China last November. So hadn't been here for long, but I can see Chinese government is really driving the idea using data as a production force. So in Chinese, it's called 数据是生产要素. So meaning data is going to be a production force, as you said earlier. So China is really driving that. You mentioned that Shanghai just opened a new data trading center. Actually, the first one was opened actually in Beijing in March already. And there will be one I heard in Shenzhen. There will be one in other places. Anyway, they are building that. So the Chinese government is really now pushing the digital economy, but within the Chinese realm, in the sense, they are emphasizing digital sovereignty for the Chinese, you know what I mean, right? But on the other hand, Chinese government is also, I think, doing a good thing in the sense that they try to define precisely privacy, even though the document is not completed out yet, but they are doing that. I think China actually is really thinking about how to do data trading properly. And we're not sure actually how to do it, because data is very different from other assets. It can be replicated many times. If I sell to you, David, you can immediately sell to many people. How to control it. We don't really have a good mechanism to control data trading at the moment. I think in order to make really this kind of economy work, especially in terms of data flow, I think we have to collaborate internationally. I don't think there's any other way out, because the internet has no border, right? If I sell data to you, really, David, you can sell to anybody you want or around the world. And I lose the value of data, basically, right? So most people actually these days, in my understanding, are reluctant to selling data, are reluctant sharing data. So this is one of the reasons I think that this MPC thing is very popular now, called a multi-party competition, which is in China they say is you can use the data, but you cannot see the data. So this is basically as a service. So I think if we don't collaborate, I think we'll be within countries, everybody will build their own rules, somehow control the black data. A black market data trading, but internationally will be a total pirating. Just do whatever you want. For example, I think it's very clear that if Chinese data outflow out of China, Chinese government thinks they cannot control it. Same apply to US data. If the government cannot have agreement, I think this is what will happen. But within China, I actually just moved here. As I said, I don't know too much about what is going on. I've been doing some work with the data trading center. For example, the Beijing data trading center, I'm actually helping them to develop some technology to ensure, how to do data trading properly. I think this is something government, I think, really must work with, because data trading is very hard. I can give a simple example. For example, suppose, David, you and me, if we trade data, okay, if I have agreement, and then I cannot even do the normal trading in the sense of, if I sell you Apple, I can take a picture, put on your door that I give you the Apple. But data, I cannot. If I email data, you got it, you say, I didn't receive it. What can I do? It's nothing. I cannot prove that I give it to you already, and you can refuse to pay me. Such a simple problem, we don't have a solution yet. So I believe we must, in my understanding, we must work together in order to make full use of data. Otherwise, once the data out of my door, I totally lose control. And for here, it's not just only technology. We must have a law, have a regulations to control this kind of phenomenon. So if we do not work together, I think the black market will be the main market. So I believe we must work together. There's no other way. And so for me, my understanding is the Chinese government actually very emphasize foreign data trading. I think in Hainan Island, they intend to build a data trading center specialized in international data trading. But here again, as I mentioned earlier, there's a concern privacy, right? So I know, you guys didn't mention the name. I think, David, you mentioned earlier delisting. You're talking about Didi, right? The taxi,
yes,
the taxi hauling service. But I think for me, I heard the story from what I heard is actually the Chinese government concern is legitimate. Because, for example, Didi has a huge amount of data. And, and you could be, where I have been in Beijing all over the place, because I use Didi all the time. if Didi has data out to the United States, they can basically know what everybody doing in China. I don't think that's acceptable. I think they must call in Chinese called "toming," which means remove the privacy. Yeah, it's okay to cross the border as long as you remove the privacy. You cannot trace people anymore. So this has to be done properly as well. So
well, we have the problem with American health data. There have been efforts to digitize American patient records. Google tried that and failed. The problem is that hospitals and medical practices don't want to pass on patient data, even if it's anonymous, even if patients have signed a legal waiver to release their data, because the privacy laws in the United States might allow retroactive lawsuits. So the fear of litigation has effectively paralyzed that in the United States, whereas China has a wealth of medical data. So far, we have no solution to that.
True, but they are trying. So I talked to the Beijing Data Trading Center. They call it Beijing Big Data Trading Center, 就北京大数据交易所, the one I saw in March. I think one of the examples they told me actually is there are Chinese patients who wants to seek service from German doctors. So they did something, I don't know the exact details, like removing privacy, such as they can send, the Chinese government actually allows them to send the medical data from China to the German doctors, and then they will feed back their medical advice. Actually, it happened already. This is one of the examples they are showing the power of this new trading center. So I think we must, and as I said earlier, so the privacy is a concern. I think everybody concerned. So we have to have regulations define precisely what does it mean the data does not contain privacy anymore. I mean, this is still a very vague area. Do you agree? Like, how much information we remove such that we can ensure the privacy? I mean, there's no, I mean, people say that we want to do that, but there's no precisely defined rules, right? What is enough? So I see, actually, for me, it's very encouraging to see in China what they're doing. At least they're building laws now, precise, given precise definitions and so on. And the new laws are coming out of China every few months. I think I heard the new laws are coming out still about the trading data and so on. So I think in this sense, I think we also must work together. It means regulations, how to regulate data, how to stop the black market, how to stop people selling data they don't own. You know what I mean? So this is all the problem we have to solve. So of course, Chinese government is really, I think, pushing hard. But this is a very difficult problem. I think there's a long way to go in terms of make full use of data as a production force. So therefore, my overall opinion is that there's no border in terms of data. Before, if you have a huge amount of oil, if you want to ship across the border, if the government doesn't agree, there's no way you can do it. Do you agree?
Yes.
But now, if David, if you have a 10 gig of data, if you want to ship across the border, you do like that. So this is I don't think there's a border on the internet.
I think China is trying to do everything it can to enact artificial barriers to transfers on the internet.
But they cannot. I doubt they can. Now Elon Musk is building this new network in the sky. How do they do that? I don't know.
It's baked fundamentally into essentially every central piece of data and digital related legislation in China. There's that part, the associating geography with privacy and data protection and control, which I think is misfounded, because as long as it's connected to the internet, it's exposed to the same sort of cybersecurity risks, whether it's stored in China or the US. What matters are the administrative and technical controls that the provider uses around it. But it's also fundamentally at the heart of it, and this is goes to the question of trust, and this is obviously something that
yes.
Andy deals with all the time, in that it's obviously a trust issue between the EU and the US with Schrems and the surveillance, and then them trying to sort of like come together and figure out appropriate guardrails and redress mechanisms around this so that data can continue to flow. But it's also puts into contrast the sort of the black hole at the heart of many pieces of Chinese legislation, is that you are right in that China is pushing ahead with new data privacy, cybersecurity and data security laws. But at the heart of that are little to no controls over government access to data. And that is at the fundamental heart of what is at the dispute between the EU and the US. And so unless China changes its approach and agrees to limits on its access to data, I doubt it will be able to fundamentally address the underlying concerns about trust that are at the heart of many good and bad policies in the US and EU around data transfers as it relates to China and Chinese tech companies. And that sort of gets to, I suppose, a final point that I wanted to raise here that's important for Andy and others is like, this gets to my overarching point of potential negativity in that can we get to a world where US firms can operate in China and Chinese firms can operate in the US, and policymakers and regulators on both sides can trust that entities on both sides are abiding by local laws, but that the other country, the other government, isn't doing anything that is extraterritorial and impinges upon their sovereignty, and such that they allow firms to operate in these two very different worlds. At the moment, we've just seen sort of them pulling up the drawbridges sort of one by one in making it increasingly harder for, and China's been doing this for much longer than the US, for US firms in China, but the US is now starting to reciprocate in making it much harder for Chinese firms to operate here. Can we get to a world where firms can operate on both sides and policymakers can trust that they're abiding by local laws as much as they may not like the other side's local laws, but doing so recognizing that they exist and that they need to find a way to operate across these borders. Otherwise, we'll simply end up with multiple different sort of digital walled gardens.
Tom Stefanik made a point before, which I thought was very telling that we didn't pick up on, which is you have a handful of enormous American tech companies who are making more money than any company has ever made in the past, who collect vast amounts of data. There's a great deal of controversy over how much data they actually get. No one knows quite, what they're pulling out of your smartphone, and you read exposés about it in the tech press every day. directions than we've used in the United States, which has really been concentrated on advertising. Is it possible that the Chinese big data model and the US big data model will simply evolve in different directions as China focuses more on industries, say, other than advertising, logistics, transportation, manufacturing, and so forth?
Well, I think you are seeing, and I think folks may disagree, that our website is remarkably transparent in terms of what we're doing and how we're doing it and what we plan to do. I think the world of 5G to business is going to be moving in exactly the direction that already characterizes, for example, a company like ours, our ability to trace back the components that are in our products for our entire supply chain and provide tracing of the software throughout the supply chain so that we can communicate with our customers if there's a vulnerability found in proprietary software, open source software, or third-party software. So we see in the thousands of 5G to business applications that are being developed around the world, the importance of data for enterprises to be able to improve their efficiency and how to improve, and the ability to use big data analytics and artificial intelligence to help folks do that and help folks compete is really just the tip of the iceberg. And someone earlier mentioned healthcare, which is obviously a gigantic use case. The idea of recognizing that the benefits that are going to come from the technologies that 5G won't enable, we only see a tip of the iceberg of the criticality of facilitating that kind of information. And Nigel wrote a great article that he sent us the links to about promoting data flow. But the idea of saying, look, fundamentally, we in the US, it's not just about the need to protect advertising data. Generally, the US, for the most part, has not cared about personal data and to a lesser extent hasn't focused on the criticality of organizational data for us to maintain the resilience of the greater dependency we're going to have when 5G enabled technologies really roll out. And you see it in the discussion about TikTok and WeChat, I guess it was last year, where the emphasis was on who owns and controls those companies. And you saw Elon Musk, who made comments about the fact, and of course they get a lot of data in terms of their intelligent automobiles, that he wouldn't improperly share the data with anybody. And I think that all that is missing the boat. And part of it in the US is grounded on the fact that we really don't care about privacy here in the US, but that we need to come up with, for these new technologies, for our dependence, national security and otherwise, we need an objective and transparent basis for knowing which products and services are worthy of trust. And there needs to be a continuous trust through verification, but the data can't simply be about who owns WeChat or TikTok. It's got to be about where is the data, how's it protected, how can we follow the data, and how can we facilitate independent audits of companies that own apps, of companies involved in the telecom operator space, telecom equipment space. How can we come up with techniques for auditing, independent auditing of these processes and techniques, so we have an objective and transparent basis to know that the data is being protected and it will be there when we need it.
Well, that gets back to Jin Tai's point, which is how can you assess data protection if we don't know what the technological standards for data security are? And I'd like to come back to Jin Tai and try to ask a question as stupidly as I can, because the issues that he deals with as a mathematician are way above my head. Jin Tai, could you describe for us? I mean, a lot of us have a rough idea what public key cryptography can do, but a quantum computer, which is very powerful, can ultimately break, maybe it already can break public key cryptography. What are the alternatives and how practical are they? If you could tell us that in a way that a dumb layman like me might understand.
Okay, I'll try my best. So, I mean, the idea of public cryptography was proposed by Diffie and Hellman in 1970s. And the first idea that really achieve the goal was done by ISA, a reverse Shamir-Edelman. So they used a mathematical question, which is given two large prime numbers. It's easy to multiply them. But given a large number, you know it's a product of two prime numbers, how to factor is very hard. And the hardness of the factorization is the basis of security, which means the factorization, the two prime factors are your private key, and the product is the public key. And we use the public key to verify or to do key exchange. And we use the private key to sign or to send the secret information, to decrypt the message. So that's the fundamental idea of the first generation public key cryptography. It relied on number theory problems. And one example is the factorization, okay? So ISA basically relied, let me repeat, the fact that it's easy to multiply two numbers, but it's difficult to factor it. And quantum computer happen to be very effective solving it. So post-quantum cryptography are looking for new mathematical structures to build such a system. And for example, mostly the existing standards, standard candidates are based on 3 or 4 type of problems. One is lattice. So this is the most schema lattice. So lattice is basically like a grid. Inside grid, we want to find a short vector. That's the hard mathematical problem. Another one is called a multivariate. It's a find the solution of a set of multivariate equation. Another one related to error correcting code. And another one based on hash functions. Those are the 4 different categories. There's also isogeny based systems. So there are 5 categories. There are 5 new mathematical problems we believe, we cannot really prove, we believe they are hard to be broken by a quantum computer. And we hope to build a system based on those mathematical problems. So that's the basic idea behind the post-quantum cryptography. But which one is the best? We don't really know, I have to say.
And when will I have that installed in an app on my smartphone?
Oh, we have it already. We have candidates already. What we do not agree on, which one is the best? Which one can really sustain the quantum computer attack? That's what we do not agree on. For example, one very interesting system is hash-based signature. And we believe it's very secure. But hash-based signature has one bad thing is it has something called state, which means you have to keep tracing of something all the time, which means if you install on 2 different devices, and then that's very bad for you if you don't synchronize all the time. So this is just the post-quantum cryptography is much more complicated. Certain systems are much more faster in computation, but the bigger key size, and so on, so on. I mean, we don't have a clear window. So I think that's the issue also, in terms of selecting which one is the best.
At this point, I'd like to start asking some questions that have been sent in from the audience. And I think the first, Jintao, would probably be directed to you, though everyone's free to jump in. If there is a race to quantum computing capacity by the US and China, and one side reaches it first, won't it assume the other side will also reach it and therefore be able to detect that they got there first, that they got there second, rather? This suggests a preemptive strike rather than waiting for the other side to uncover quantum capacity with their own quantum computer as a plausible game theoretic strategic move. The question is beyond me, but you might understand it.
Yeah, I understand. I think I disagree. I mean, did you guys watch the movie Imitation Game about Turing? Did you guys watch it?
Yes, sure.
And there's a scene, right? The intercept a message, and then the brother of one of the colleagues on that boat, I mean, the U-boat going to attack, and then they refuse to send a message to that boat because then it would tell Germans they broke the Enigma machine, right? I don't think, if I have the quantum computer, I will keep as long as possible because I can read every message that my opponent is sending. Why don't I sit there and be in a very good position? I think this is what I think I would do. You know what I mean, right? So
yes, like with Enigma.
Yes, like the Enigma. And so I will tell you a funny story I had. So 2 years ago, I think in 2019, I went to Brazil to give a lecture. And a friend invited me. His name is Professor Tereda. He's a Brazilian Japanese cryptographer. And we were chatting. he told me a story about the Falkland War. I mean, you guys must know, right? The Falkland War.
Yes.
And so during the war, the Navy of Argentina called the Ministry of Defense of Brazil, asked them, "Is it okay we are still using Enigma machine?" And the Minister of Defense in Brazil called Professor Tareda, and he was laughing. He said, "You idiots, you know." So I think the consequence of the Falkland War is decided even before it started.
I didn't know that. That's remarkable.
Yeah, you can Professor Tareda. You can find him and ask him. This is what exactly he told me. So this is a very I wouldn't think they would I wouldn't. I think if I have a quantum computer, I wouldn't tell anybody. Rather than I will enjoy the best best time of my life, reading everybody's email, knowing what is going on everywhere in the world.
I don't know if I'm going to sleep tonight, Jintai, after hearing that, but
I don't know. But maybe somebody has a quantum computer already. I don't know. But I mean, this is I mean, those organizations are ahead. I think we don't know how much they know, but it's a good idea being prepared. You know what I mean, right? So. I have been involved in the post-quantum work for a long time. For example, I talk with people in AWS, Amazon Web Service. Their customers are very concerned, especially people who have sensitive data. They ask them very important question: are you ready? Amazon Web Service, because a lot of sensitive data are in the storage, and they will hold. I mean, they will be very liable if something, because of quantum attack and so on. They will be in big trouble.
Well, following up on that, we have a question, which again is for you, Jintai. How is post-quantum cryptography related to blockchain projects like Bitcoin and Ethereum?
Oh, very good question. So my opinion is that once you have a quantum computer, blockchain, and Bitcoin at least is finished. So let me expand a little bit. Maybe most of you know already. So in the Bitcoin, we don't use encryption. We only use digital signature, which is an elliptic curve digital signature. For example, David, when you own some Bitcoin, you don't own a Bitcoin. It's your private key which owns. When they give you the money, they give you the address. The address is a short form of your public key. It's a hash of the public key. So we use that to verify when you give me, for example, David, suppose you want to give me 1 Bitcoin, you have to write a sentence that David agreed to give 1 Bitcoin to Jintai, and you have to sign. Only you who has a private key can sign, but the public key, everybody knows, can verify it is from you. Therefore, we agree that you give 1 to me. That's how it works. So if you have a quantum computer, once the public key is exposed, I can calculate private key, I can take all your Bitcoins. But if I don't know the public key, if I only know the address, let me repeat, I cannot take anything. But in Bitcoin, there's one very interesting step, which is when I do transaction, there's a 10 minutes delay because we have to do POW and so on. During this period, if your transaction delayed, people have a quantum computer, then they can compute your private key and do a new transaction to to replace your transaction, then they can send all the Bitcoin to themselves. But for those whose public key is already exposed, then you are finished. They can just take all your Bitcoin right away. And recently, Bitcoin did an update called Taproot. I don't know if you guys know. They use Schneider signature. And this is actually very bad because in this case, all their public key are exposed. So they are very much prone to the attack from a quantum computer. So they made the situation worse. I don't understand why they did that. This is something I don't understand. So I believe quantum computer must be updated to a new post-quantum signature, otherwise they're finished. This is my opinion.
Well, I think at least 20% of our listeners are probably running now to call their brokers right now. After
no. For
hearing
now,
that.
it's okay. For now, it's still okay. But you should not expose your public key. I think for the moment, at least. But in the future, still you should be worried. But I mean, there are discussions already. I mean, the Bitcoin developers, they have a big discussion about this already. There are people already saying, but once they have an update, it should be okay. But you have to update, right? For example, if they update their system, you must update your own wallet using the new post-quantum signatures, then you're okay. So just like our IT system. But on the other hand, relating to the earlier question, So if I have a quantum computer, you know what I would do first? I would steal Bitcoins because there's no liability there. I wouldn't attack other banks because you attack banks, there's a big lawsuit and whatever, you caught, you go to jail. But in my opinion, okay, this is just my personal opinion. If I have a quantum computer, I take your Bitcoin, it's legal. In my opinion, because I'm doing the normal game. I mean, I didn't do anything. I see your public key, I compute a private key, and then I send the money to my account, just as if you did it. Nobody can tell. So that's how Bitcoin works.
That's absolutely remarkable. Thank you for that. I don't own any Bitcoin, but of our listeners who do, I'm sure they.
No, I'm
sure
pretty
you
sure
have their
people should find new
undivided
solutions.
attention.
Yes.
Here's a question for anyone in the panel. Everyone seems to be saying that international trade in data is very important. But if the United States is using data for advertising and China is using it for 5G to business, these are different applications. So why can't China do very well with a data autarky all by itself?
Well, I'll take a first swing at that. It's because true data innovation and true sort of like competitiveness in today's data-driven economy depends on having large, diverse data sets, right? China has an inherent domestic advantage in that, but these markets, these issues are global. And there are differences in these global data sets. And so these firms may be very good if they stay completely within the confines of China, may do very well, but find that their program, their services, their goods do not sort of adapt well to changing differential changes that are inevitably there in other countries, other people's, other organizations' data. So that's fine. I mean, it could be the king at home, but find that it's woefully out of whack globally, and that's the point. And it's sort of like it fundamentally goes against the underlying openness of the internet, which is that it shouldn't depend on nationality. There shouldn't be these borders, this artificial disaggregation of data and data-driven development. But it's a matter of how do different firms and different countries specialize in particular components of the digital economy. And that's very different, right? Because the train has already left the station on search and social and everything else. There are already first mover advantages. They've seized that advantage. It's a matter of like, how do firms elsewhere in the United States or elsewhere around the world find their niche capabilities or find the emerging sort of area where data innovation is going and seize that advantage there for in terms of demonstrating new and innovative ways of using data, because this is dynamic. The competition is relentless. The competition is coming from everywhere. That the firms that lead at the moment can't rest on their laurels, because there are any number of firms coming after them that in today's digital economy can greatly change the market structure of a market really quickly. I mean, Huawei is a great example of that, right? Like just fundamentally changed the social media game. And so I think that's it's a very narrow-minded view of data-driven innovation to think that you simply stay within your country's confines and that'll be enough, because if you truly want to be a global leader in whatever your data-driven service is, you need to be global. That's the long and short of it. And so it's simply, you will never be truly competitive and innovative if you simply stay within your country's borders.
Here is a question for Andy Purdy. You mentioned before, I'm trying to summarize the question, which is sort of long. You mentioned before that audit standards for data security would be critical to make all of this work. Is this something that can be done through an international standardization body? And if so, which international standardization body for such audits would be appropriate? What would you propose as the best vehicle for accomplishing that?
Well, I wish I had an easy answer for that. I mean, I think one of the best groups to help lead what I think is necessary in terms of a collaboration to try to figure that out is the International Association of Privacy Professionals. I think they've got a great understanding of the reality, the benefits, and perhaps some shortcomings of the European Privacy Directive, GDPR. They've got quite a handle on the fact that the US has like 50 state data privacy laws, and of course, 50 data breach notification laws, and total absence of national privacy legislation or data breach legislation, which is harmful to companies, and it's also harmful to individuals. But I think IAPP, and there's some other groups in the United States as well, I think need to try to bring people together to get some answers. The work that Commerce is doing right now, someone mentioned the aftermath of the Privacy Shield, and of course the very difficult challenge of ever getting something to replace it, given some of the points that were made before. But a lot of groups are participating in that process with the hope that it can help American businesses if they can have a way to meet those requirements. But I think it's going to have to be a collaboration. I think NIST is a great group to participate in it. It's just there hasn't really been a driving focus. And although you mentioned some of the issues with our social media companies and those major issues, and I don't want to minimize those, but the ideas around data privacy are fundamental. And we can't wait till we address the major problems in our social media companies, because if we wait for that, we're never going to have something that we can use.
In response to a listener question, yes, recording will be available to all attendees. Asia Times will post it both on our Facebook page and on YouTube, and I believe that American Affairs will do so as well. Here's a question which I think is probably more of a comment, though anyone is free to respond. Why is data privacy so important to China? In the US, we have accepted that Google and Facebook now know our thoughts and have for the better part of 2 decades. And even with our data, they failed to do anything except to sell it to advertisers. Comments not required, but
yeah. No, I'm happy to take a swing at it, noting the joking nature about Google and Facebook's role in our lives. And as an expecting parent now Googling for baby stuff, I fully appreciate their efforts to try and find me the products I'll need to get. But I think it gets to actually a really interesting point in that there is actually a real grassroots consumer-driven push for greater data privacy and protection coming in China. This isn't just a thing sort of like top-down state-directed, that Chinese people are increasingly concerned about how tech companies are using or misusing and abusing their data, and have been seeking better legal recourse to take action against that. There has been a genuine drive towards that. And in a similar way, and I know this for a fact from folks that track this on the ground in a granular level, like China's application of its new cybersecurity law has been mainly targeted at domestic Chinese cowboys operating there that have simply up until now been operating without rules or restrictions and taking action against them. Obviously, there was a large fear initially that it would be used to target foreign firms, but what we've seen from its initial application is that it's mainly been targeted at these bad actors. And that reflects in part because foreign firms in China have sophisticated IT and legal compliance systems in place and are trying to do their best to abide by local laws, whereas there are many other operators in China at the time pre these laws that basically didn't abide by any rules. So there's those two facts. But then underlying this, and this gets back to my third point, is that despite these sort of commercial, consumer-based sort of measures of progress, there's the underlying concern of what, if any, guardrails is the Chinese government willing to accept around government access to data. And I again just raise that again because that is at the heart of so many of these points of conflict between the US and China, the US and Europe, and elsewhere around the world, that the whether real or not, those concerns can lead to some very sort of harsh and restrictive policies as it relates to data and digital technology companies. And the more unclear and vague that is, the harder it is for policymakers to allow data to go to those countries. And so the more transparency, the more auditability, the more accountability, the more threshold, the more restrictions placed on government access that there are, that people can see and believe in, the better we will be going in creating the type of trust we need to know that everyone, private firms and the government, are playing by the rules in protecting and using data.
Indeed, if only the Chinese government had the absolute respect for law and due process and privacy that our national security agency has shown in the past.
Yeah.
Tom Stefanik, you have a thought?
Well, yeah, I actually, just picking up on the difficulties that Nigel mentioned, China makes it even more difficult for the American political entities, to kind of grapple with this or try to find some way through this by being very clear that they have an internal policy of what they call civil military fusion. Now there's a kind of a nuanced view of that. In the United States, we have some civil military connections, large defense companies, where military people move in and out, but it's different in China. There are a series of laws. Nigel could probably speak to this more than me, but the discussion, when it gets onto the Hill and when it gets into arguments about dealing with China, they have connected the geostrategic competition that we're now in. This is natural between the incumbent great power and the new rising power. That's just international politics. But they've directly connected that to this question that Nigel was pointing out. So that makes it harder.
Andy Purdy and Tom Stefanik, you're both Americans who worked at a high level in advising the government on cybersecurity issues. If Joe Biden and Xi Jinping said, look, you two guys go into a room and don't come out until you have some kind of workable arrangement to allow us to share this space and work together in these problems, do you think you could do it?
Why don't you start, Andy?
It kind of reminds me of the discussions we had among like 30 or 40 government agencies after the first national cyberstorm exercise when I was at the DHS. And we were talking about the bad things that could happen. And the FBI or Justice said, we're doomed. And then he said, okay, well, we're doomed, but now we got to figure out, what we're going to do and how we do it, how we pair it, make America safer and all that. And sometime later, he said, it's hopeless. I don't see the direct talks between the presidents of the two countries as critical anytime soon. I think we need to build on the private sector work, the track 2, the economic dialogue. They've got a lot of important recommendations, such as to have third-party monitoring on the issue of dual use of military and civil activities. I think the question of what's necessary, what the rules of the road need to be. My company operates in 170 countries, and we believe we can comply with the laws of each of those countries. And we are open to recommendations. And I think it's one of the areas of technology innovation that has been sorely lacking, or at least I'm not aware of it, is the idea of saying, okay, well, what kinds of things can be done to promote transparency? And of course, you have the challenge of you can't give governments certain information because governments will violate the trust of that information. But so what kind of mechanisms can be in place where we can prove, and other companies can prove, that our products and our people are not subject to the improper influence of a government anywhere? And so I remember I was at the RSA conference over a year ago, and at a private event, Ann Newberger, then head of cybersecurity for the National Security Agency, was part of the panel. And I asked the question, well, I said, well, would NSA be willing to come into Huawei facilities around the world and evaluate what we do and how we do it, and make recommendations for how we can have greater assurance, how we can have greater accountability, and how we can have greater transparency. And of course, she said that the statutes in the U.S. don't allow that because we're not part of the U.S. defense industrial base. But that idea of saying what is possible, what kind of techniques, such as cloud-based capabilities, and we saw the recent report by NSA and CISA about the threats to 5G that can go through cloud providers. But what are some techniques, what are some technologies that can be used to create an objective and transparent basis for knowing that the people and products of a particular suppliers or operator are worthy of trust? And we're open to those conversations. We're open to those discussions. There is an assumption that certain things are the case. Well, okay, here's the offer. Come in. How do we and others, what do we need to do to provide assurance, whether it's independent testing of the products to show there are no backdoors, that's the policies, processes, and technology where we can prove that we are not improperly accessing data or sending it back to anybody. And we're not saying that's perfect, but those are the kinds of things that need to happen so that we have an objective and transparent basis for knowing which products and services are worthy of trust. And given the importance of this technology, which has generally not been all that important in the last 18, 19 years, but it's going to be important, at least if the U.S. takes advantage of some of the competitiveness ideas that Rob Atkinson talked about in this recent paper, we can move forward and the risk can be addressed.
Dom, you want to respond?
Yeah, I actually have a somewhat different view in that it's run by one person and one party, and that's the way it works. Control of the military runs through the Central Military Commission, down through the various military organizations. That's the setup. So if you don't have top level guidance, I think, and top level agreements, perhaps with some verification measures, which are the nature that Andy was talking about, you won't have you won't be able to, I think, politically, at least within the United States and its allies, have some basis for pulling together an agreement with trust, because again, these are geopolitical forces that are driving the United States and China, just like these are geopolitical forces that are driving them towards competition and hopefully not, but possibly conflict and crisis in the Taiwan Straits over Taiwan and other issues that are well understood, that are the kind of feeding this. And in the Soviet era, we of course did this. I mean, we had not company to company so much. We had very little company to company organization, but we had scientist to scientist exchanges. And then we also had government organized verification measures. Now, this is regard to physical systems like large nuclear weapons and silos and things that you could see from space or aircraft. But it will require the very top level governmental processes that pull along the companies.
If I may respond for a moment, Tom, I agree with everything you just said. What I'm suggesting is that there needs to be a lot more work and input from the private sector before those meetings should be held. And I'll take the example of the private sector input on the Commerce Department effort for how to handle evaluation of foreign ICTS transactions. That there's been a lot of input from a lot of different groups. I think that kind of input needs to move forward. I'm afraid of what the president might commit to or might sign up to if there is not more input and more work done by our private sector, so there can be a real informed dialogue on behalf of the United States by President Biden.
Thank you. There's a question which I think is for Jin Tai regarding the difficulties he mentioned earlier in data trading. The question is there a solution using technology The questioner mentions things like zero knowledge proof, multi-party computation, blockchain, and so forth. Can Jintai say a bit more about what technologies might provide solutions to the problem of data trading without completely going over our heads?
No. I think it's very simple because data, I mean, the only tools we can protect data is really encryption technology, authentication and so on. So I think that basically, yes, the names he mentioned are all good technology. For example, multi-party communication is a very important tool. And this is actually could be a good way to share data internationally because multi-communication allows two parties compute something based on two data without seeing each other's data. So even between China and United States, David, for example, you have a data in DC and then somebody has data in Beijing. You can put the data together to compute something, but without sending data across the border. But unfortunately, multi-party computation is very slow, very inefficient, even though it's a very good solution. And for first problem, we can do it. So mostly, I think at the moment, what we focus on is using cryptography technology. I mean, all this we use and to help to secure data trading. That's what they are doing. Make it traceable, and so such that I foresee in the future all the data trading will be recorded on the blockchain or on multiple database, so we can trace everything. Only by doing that we can prevent the black market. Otherwise, we just cannot. So I foresee there will be a big push in using cryptographic technology to ensure efficient, secure data trading. This is what I believe.
We just have a few minutes left. I'd like to ask each of our distinguished panelists to make a brief concluding remark. Let's go in alphabetical order. Start with Nigel.
Thanks, David. Thanks, Julius. I really appreciated the discussion. My final concluding point is that while some of these issues and some of these disputes around data governance and digital technologies are not new, they're certainly reaching a crescendo in how they're causing sort of real points of conflict between countries. It's now a matter, again, as I mentioned earlier, for how do countries react to this in terms of ensuring they have the requisite domestic regulations and infrastructure in place, but then also simultaneously developing an international strategy, because the internet is global, it's an interconnected technology, and so they have no choice but to govern these issues in a shared construct. And how do you manage that so that data can still flow freely, that it is protected as per local laws, but that countries don't act artificial, misguided barriers to data flows, so that we can still have a globally connected, rules-based digital economy. And they need to be more proactive about doing that, the United States especially, because on the other side, China is developing a model based around control and cyber sovereignty that just simply doesn't recognize that it needs to enter into this type of shared governance with other countries if it wants to be a sort of a responsible player in the global digital economy.
Thank you. Jintai?